Well, good Monday morning. Welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And I am in the process of sharing some thoughts with you in response to viewer requests about what happened to those under the Old Covenant when they died, the righteous, what happens to us now when we die. And I've pointed out that under the Old Covenant, there was no legitimate objective forgiveness of sins. And thus, while men might be called righteous, when they died, because the blood of bulls and goats could never take away sin, Hebrews 10, 1-3, they could not enter into the most holy place. You know, Hebrews chapter 9, to me, is one of the most definitive texts that speak to this in all of the Bible. And it speaks of the absolute necessity for the death of Jesus, the atoning power of the death of Jesus. But notice that it says, Hebrews chapter 9, 6-9. When these things, he's talking about the Old Covenant Tabernacle, the temple, the ordinances surrounding it. When these things had been thus prepared, the priest always went into the first part of the tabernacle, performing the services. So in the temple, you had the holy place, the veil, and the most holy place. Into the second part, which of course is the most holy place, the high priest went alone once a year, not without blood, which he offered for himself and for the people's sins committed in ignorance. Now watch this. Watch very carefully. The Holy Spirit is indicating this, that the way into the holiest of all was not yet made manifest while the first tabernacle was still standing. It was symbolic for the present time, in which both gifts and sacrifices are offered, which cannot make him who performed the service perfect in regard to the conscience. Concerned only with foods and drinks, various washings, and fleshly ordinances imposed until the time of reformation. Now, this text just demands a whole lot of unpacking because it's just so rich. But here's the bottom line. The writer very clearly expresses, here's this Old Covenant system, the Old Covenant cultic practices of its new moons, its feast days, its Sabbaths, its sacrifices. Those were all, he says, symbolic. Greek word is parabole, parabolic. They pointed to something else. And by the way, I have to point this out. In the text, virtually all of the verbs here are in the present active indicative. They're not in the past tense, as the New King James unfortunately renders them, and other translations as well. They're all in the present active indicative, virtually every one of them. The writer is speaking at a time in which the sacrifices were, when he was writing, being offered. They could not, at the time he was writing, make the worshiper perfect. All right. Now, notice what he says. As long as that Old Covenant system stood, there was no entrance into the most holy place. Now, the word, while it still stands, as virtually all Greek scholars have pointed out, it's not simply as long as that system stood, in other words, as long as the temple's still standing. No, it's not the idea. The idea is as long as that Old Covenant system had validity, had standing with God, there was no access to the most holy place, i.e., no access to the presence of God. So, in a broad sweeping generalization, all of those prior to the accomplished work of Christ could not enter into the most holy place, i.e., they could not enter heaven when they died, because animal sacrifices could never take away sin. Now, I'm not discussing at this point whether they were sentient and alive, so to speak, prior to that finished work. The simple point I'm making is prior to the accomplished work of Christ, there was no entrance into heaven and the most holy place. That tells us what happened to all of the Old Covenant people, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all of the Old Testament worthies listed in Hebrews chapter 11. They did not go to heaven when they died. And it tells us that the time of reformation would be the time when men, through the power of Christ, could enter into the most holy place. We have a lot more to say about this. Boy, this is rich and wonderful stuff. So we'll see you on the flip side. Don't forget to get my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air, The Wedding of the King of Kings, where I discuss a lot of this and more in regard to life after death and in regard to the time of reformation as it relates to the second coming of Christ. So, get a copy of my book, We Shall Meet Him in the Air. Go to my website, www.eschatology.org, BibleProphecy.com. Order the book. Mention that you saw the book offer on YouTube or Facebook, and I'll refund your shipping. All right? Thanks for joining me this Monday morning. Hope you have a wonderful day. We're expecting snow, but hope you have a great day. We'll see you on the flip side.